Yesterday's prophecies for today's world.
Just remember that this is a time when we all have to be bold and share the simple gospel of Jesus Christ with people.
And now, Hal Lindsey presents the Bible Prophecy Series, The Coming of the Last World Superpower.
All right, now Daniel chapter 8. And God predicted back in 606 BC, he started predicting that there would be only 4 great world empires in the future. The 5th world empire would be the kingdom of God that the Messiah would bring in and put all the other powers down and set up the kingdom of God on earth. So there would be only 4, and that the fourth world superpower, which was Rome, would not be defeated, but in stage 1 of Roman Empire, it would disintegrate from within, go into mystery form, and then rise just before the last days and the coming of Jesus as the Messiah to earth. It would rise in a phase 2, and it would be 10 nations out of the ruins of the Roman people and culture that would rise and be brought together and form the Roman Empire again. And this would be another world empire. I've been saying for 50 years that I believe it's the nations out of Europe. It's a European Union now. Predicted there would be the United States of Europe back in 1955. Not because of what I saw happening in history, but because of what I saw the Bible predict. And we see that now. But the great superpowers were all named. First there was Babylon, which would be taken over by the Medo-Persians, which would be taken over by the Greeks, which would be taken over by Rome, phase 1. And so we've looked at that, and now in chapter 8, I'm focusing on the rise of the 3rd world superpower of history, and that's the Greeks. And Daniel chapter 8 was written in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. He was the last Babylonian king of the Babylonian Empire. And his 3rd year was the year in which Babylon was overthrown by the Medo-Persians, and the king saw the handwriting on the wall, and he was told that before sunrise he would be dead because they had rejected and insulted the God of Israel. Now, it's against that background I want you to see that Daniel the prophet, who's been all of his life in Babylonian captivity, he's given some further prophecy added to some he had heard before. And in the prophecy of chapter 8, it's one of the most amazing prophecies in history. God gives him a revelation that names the empires that were about to rise. Now, let's look in that light. It says, I looked in the vision, it's in verse 2 of chapter 8. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Now I want you to remember Susa. Daniel wasn't actually in Susa of his own accord. What God did was pick him up and carry him into the future to Susa. And God often did that with his prophets. You see, this is something people have to get used to. With God, time and space is a creation. He's not bound by it. So he can time travel a prophet up to a future time. That's what he did with the Apostle John when he wrote the book of Revelation. He picked him up off of the Isle of Patmos and time traveled him up to the 21st century, and he saw all of the marvels of technology we see today was brought back to the first century, And God said, okay, now write about what you saw. How does a prophet from the first century write about intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear explosions, helicopters, things? Well, he does a good job of it if you look at the book of Revelation and you look at those symbols in the light of a first century man trying to describe what we see today. Well, we won't get into that. But right here, God took Daniel and took him to Susa. Now, I want you to remember Susa. Do you know why? That's the city in which Alexander the Great died. And it's very important when you see what's predicted here. Let's read. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns, which was standing in the front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and with the longer one coming up last. And I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue him from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. Now, hold your place and just look over at verse 20, where the interpretation of this symbol is described for us by the prophet, as it was explained to the prophet Daniel by an angel. It says, the ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Now, the Medes and the Persians were getting ready to attack Babylon when Daniel was given this prophecy. But they were not yet in power. And as far as the Babylonians were concerned, they were impregnable. No one could defeat the mighty Babylonian Empire, and the city of Babylon was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and no one, they thought, could breach the defenses of the city of Babylon. Its walls were 100 meters high, and they were wide enough at the top. They kind of came up like this, sloped up. They were wide enough at the top for 5 chariots to ride abreast all the way around the city. So, and the most important thing was the Euphrates River ran right through the center of the city, and they had great bronze gates that lowered down into the water so that no one could come into the city through the water. And they thought that it was impregnable. They thought it could never be conquered. In fact, Belshazzar conducted a big wine bust on the night that he died. It was a big orgy that he conducted to celebrate the invincibility of Babylon. And little did he know that that very night, the Medes and the Persian army had completed digging a canal to divert the Euphrates River from flowing underneath the city. And so that very night, a hand appeared in the middle of this feast, and the drunken orgy, really, and wrote on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Basically, it meant you have been weighed in God's balance. You have been found wanting. You're divided. And Daniel was called in to interpret the dream, and he said, you've been weighed in God's justice balance, and you have been rejected. And this night, the city will fall, and you will not see tomorrow's sunrise. And he didn't, because the water was diverted in their self-confidence. They didn't notice the water receding. Once it receded enough, the Medo-Persian army flowed underneath the great iron gates into the city and overthrew it. So the city that was considered absolutely impregnable fell in a night. When God says it's over, it's over. Nothing man constructs or does, can stop it. Well, this is talking about the conquest of Media-Persia. And as I said last week, the ram represents Media-Persia. And it's interesting, the Media-Persians themselves chose the ram later as the symbol of their empire because it was one of the parts of the zodiac, Aries, the ram. Now, as it speaks about it, the ram budding westward. See, they come from the east of Babylon. He budded westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. All right? So much for Babylon. That was this predicts the rise of the second world superpower, Media-Persia. Now, verse 5. And while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. And in its place there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Look at verse 21 now. Here's the interpretation, divine interpretation of that. The shaggy he-goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. This was over 200 years before Alexander the Great was born. And yet it predicts it would be this young genius king of the Greeks that would destroy the mighty Persian Empire, which hadn't even taken over Babylon yet. And this information was received where? In Susa. Going on. And the broken horn and the four horns that rose in its place represent four kingdoms which will rise from his nation, although not with his power. All right, let's see how this plays out. By the way, Alexander chose the symbol of the great he-goat, not knowing about this prophecy. Capricorn, the he-goat. They both thought that symbols from the zodiac that was somehow related to the timing of their birth and so forth had something to do with their power. Alexander was born in Macedonia. He was the son of Philip II of Macedonia. And when he was born, some of the Greek tribes lived on the other side of the Aegean Sea. And there's a narrow point up here where the Aegean Sea goes into the Black Sea. And that is called the Hellespont, the Greek bridge, because that's where the Greeks would cross from Europe into Asia. You literally go from one continent to the other in the small canal. And there were some Greek tribes that lived on the other side of the Aegean Sea, and they were on the coast, along this coast here, what is now modern Turkey, that there were some Greek tribes that were greatly mistreated by the Medes and Persians. Some of them were of the tribe of Troy. Alexander grew up watching his father with the military. He had a very fine army, his father, Philip, and he used to, as a young boy, go out and watch them doing special maneuvers and preparing for war. His father wanted to attack at least the coastline of Persia, because they had mistreated these tribes of Greeks. But when Alexander was only 18, his father was assassinated. Now, some thought that Alexander somehow put somebody up to it. He claimed that he swore to his dying father that he had nothing to do with it. But in the result, some training that Alexander had, courtesy of his father, began to pay off, because, you see, his father recognized that Alexander was a prodigy. He was a genius. And so he went to Athens and virtually kidnapped Aristotle and brought him there to train his son. And it was soon obvious that Alexander was a genius in almost every field, in language, in philosophy, in mathematics, but he was especially a genius in military. So when his father was assassinated, he took over the Macedonian army. And his mother, who was I believe an occultist, she had so ingrained Alexander that he was born to be great. He was born to be a god, that he really believed it. And so when he took over the Macedonian army, he had this vision. And I believe that vision was put in his heart by God, because God will use anyone to achieve his purpose. He had this vision that he was chosen to unite all of the warring tribes of the Greeks, to conquer them and then force them to unite, and to put them into one great empire, and especially one great army. But no one had ever, not one tribe of the Greeks was ever able to conquer all the others and put them together. Alexander did it in 3 years. He took over the Macedonian army. They defeated the Spartans, the Ionians, the Athenians, the Troy, everybody. But what Alexander did is he fought them until they surrendered, but then he welcomed them to come in, and he began to give them, with his great oratory, he began to convince them that they were destined to rule the world, that they were going to be the greatest empire in the world. And he began to give them a vision of what they could do if they were united together. And he was able, single-handed, to unite these tribes that had warred with each other for centuries. Now that took some genius right there. But when the main thing is, he started training and forming a great army. And he began to use his genius of military tactics, much he had learned from his father and improved on. And so after training them for a couple of years, he then decided they were ready. And so he began to inflame these soldiers with anger at the Persians because they had mistreated some of their people along the coast of Turkey. It was now Turkey, it was Asia Minor then. It was the western limits of the Persian Empire at that time. And so he took the army. In 334, they crossed the Hellespont and came into the land of the Persians. And right away, they encountered some of the Persian armies. And at the battles at the Granicus River and Miletus and Halicarnassus, they defeated the military garrisons of Persia that were guarding that coastline. And I mean, they didn't just defeat them, they absolutely destroyed them. And they used a new military tactic, the phalanx. And the phalanx was something that no other army had ever had to face. And so they had such victories over the Persian army at this point as they moved down the peninsula here, or I should say the coastline, what was then the western border of Persia. They came on down, they kept coming down this way, and news got back to Darius III that there was this Greek upstart that had brought a Greek army onto Persian soil, and they had defeated some of his armies. So Darius got together the best of his army, and he started moving toward them. Now, Alexander was absolutely recklessly brave. He knew that his army did not want to face the might of the Persian army. So he kept leading them down the coastline, further away from the Hellespont, down this way, because he knew that they wouldn't be able to retreat if they wanted to. So he brings them down the coastline, and all along he was looking, he would go ahead of the troops and look for the perfect terrain to face an army that would outnumber them more than 20-1. And he looked for the perfect terrain in which to meet them and fight them. So he keeps going down the coastline until he comes to Issus. Now, Issus was all the way down here. It would be practically the northern border of modern Syria today. But it was all the way down in this region. Of course, there was no way of escape if his army wanted to desert. So he brought them to Issus because there was the perfect terrain with mountains on both sides and a narrow entrance. There was a perfect terrain for his tactics with the phalanx to work. And so he kept suckering in the Persian army to follow them, and he was baiting them, and they followed him, and they started coming through that pass. And when they did, they struck the cream of the Persian army, who was in front. They struck them first and destroyed them immediately. This really destroyed the morale of the troops. Then he had his cavalry hit them from behind and the outside of the pass. And pretty soon they were routed, and they were running, and they just decimated that army. And Darius had to flee for his life. Now that was in 333 BC. Now, after that, because he had already defeated the Persian army, and for all purposes, Persia was ripe for being taken over completely. But he diverted from that. He knew he had destroyed the army, so he went from there, and he went down into the coastline of what is now Lebanon, and he attacked Tyre. Now, Tyre is the same city today in Lebanon that he attacked. And Tyre was the head of the mighty Phoenician people. They were very, very advanced in technology for the day. And the people of Tyre had a defense rigged up that they'd perfected for decades. They had a defense rigged up here. Here's Tyre. There was an island just off of the coast of Tyre here. And they moved the city over to this island. And the island was about a mile away. Now there's a prophecy, and I should have looked this up, but I believe it's in Jeremiah. There's a prophecy that says that God was going to one day judge Tyre, and even the dust of the city would be hurled into the sea in their destruction. Well, when Tyre fled over to this island, Alexander was furious, And so he didn't leave them there. He didn't retreat. What he did is he took his army and they began to gather all of the stones and the buildings and everything and hurl it into the sea, and they built a causeway over to the island. Exactly what the prophet had predicted would happen. Of course, they destroyed Tyre, which was the principal city of the Phoenicians. But they had one other principal city. You know where it was? Familiar name today. Gaza. So Alexander marched down to Gaza to take over the rest of the Phoenicians. And on the way, he realized that his flank would be exposed to another people, these strange people called the Judeans. And so he marched on their capital, Jerusalem. And he intended to besiege Jerusalem, but when they got to the gates of Jerusalem, the high priest declared a white flag and walked out to meet, asked to meet Alexander. And he said he had a message from the God of heaven for him. So the high priest marched out to meet Alexander with a scroll of the book of Daniel. And the high priest told Alexander that his career had been predicted by the God of Israel over 200 years before. And he interpreted the book of Daniel before the gates of Jerusalem to Alexander. And he told him, you're destined to conquer the world. And though your life will be short, it will be great. Extra-biblical Hebrew history says that Alexander fell on his face before the high priest and declared that there was no God like the God of Israel. And he let the city go and declared it a free city. He did no harm to it. Isn't that just like God? That happened.